Well, I'm Gary Aguilar. I'm a practicing ophthalmologist in San Francisco, and have been in practice for quite a long time. Had no real attachment or interest in the Kennedy case in any kind of a direct way, other than that in the late 60s I heard debates, mostly on the radio, with people debating the question, was there a conspiracy, was there not a conspiracy? And it always seemed to me, particularly in the aftermath of the revelations of the Gulf and Tonkin Gulf and the things that came out about Vietnam, that the guys that were critics of the government's position, i.e., Warren critics, seemed to always have a more persuasive argument, at least to my mind. But I was busy pursuing an education, of course, and a medical degree, and then training afterward, and didn't pay it much mind. Um, in 1991, the film JFK came out, and by then I'd actually accumulated quite a number of books. Just occasionally I'd find a book and read maybe 50 or 60 pages. Books like Tink Thompson, 6 Seconds in Dallas, Rush to Judgment, Accessories After the Fact by Sylvia Marr, and things which I found pretty persuasive, and yet didn't have the time to devote to it. But when the film came out, I thought, well, I had to brush off those books I haven't looked at in many years, and see it. Could he really be right about this? Could he be right, for example, about the fact that Kennedy would not have prosecuted the Vietnam War? And so I then did spend quite a bit of time reading about it and found it endlessly fascinating. And fascinating because it was sort of consistent with so many of the things that had caused me to change my view of the world, from having grown up in a right-wing Republican conservative family to one who now saw the world rather differently in the aftermath of the revelations of what had gone on in Vietnam, and what had gone on in Latin America during the era of the Dirty Wars, where we were supporting tyrants and toppling democracies and so on and so forth. And I began saying, boy, this has the ring of truth to it, and it was very dispiriting for me as a hardcore right-wing Republican to realize that my government was not quite as honest or honorable as I thought it was. So um, the medical experience I had, having been trained as a physician and that sort of thing, naturally led me to the medical evidence in the Kennedy case. And my interest was piqued, but it really got piqued, and explained to me a lot about how the world works. When the Journal of the American Medical Association published some articles viciously slamming Oliver Stone's film in 1992. Um, and by then, even, I had read enough about the subject that I knew a lot of what was in the Journal of the American Medical Association articles was complete codswallop, complete nonsense. And I was a member of the American Medical Association in good standing. So I happened to write a letter to the editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association, which raising questions about some of the facts that they presented in the representation. And they published my letter, only to literally ignore every question that I'd raised. And I'd never seen that before in a scientific publication. The way information is communicated, scientists will write a scientific paper, a letter will come afterward, just as does in any other kind of endeavor, whether it's history, economics, sociology, paleontology, and then the author of the original paper answers the letters. Well, here we had my letter appeared along with a lot of other letters in the Journal of the American Medical Association, and we were stonewalled. We were writing letters to the autopsy doctors who had done Jack Kennedy's autopsy, who said things that I knew not to be true. And so we asked them point blank, and they published our letters. I didn't pick my letter to be published. The editors of the Journal of the American Medical Association, I'm sure, had a lot of letters, happened to pick mine. And when they stonewalled it, I said, look, it looked bad enough to me too, but I would like to believe that my own organization, the American Medical Association, would not help support deceiving the public. I was stunned. So it became a very controversial issue for us, among those of us who were critics of the Warren Commission, those of us particularly who were physicians and critics of the Warren Commission.
Hold on, let's get that again because I heard the buzz.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah.
Do you need to call?
That might be. Hello? Oh, hi, who's this? Oh, Jim, listen, I happen to be I'm being interviewed on the Kennedy case As we speak right now at Tink Thompson's house in Bolinas. Can I call you back in 20 minutes or 30 minutes, something like that? Okay. All right.
Yep.
We're on for the trip to Washington, though. I'll be there. Oh no, I don't know if Tink's guy. Yeah, that. Thank you. That's going to remind me to lean on him again. I'll try. I don't know if I'm going to have any luck, but I'll try. He's had some issues. We'll just put it that way. I'll tell him that. Okay. All right. Talk to you soon. All right. Bye bye now.
Was that one?
That's Jim Lassar.
That was Jim Lazar?
That was Jim Lassar.
Oh, I need to talk to him.
Oh well, I'll get you his number for you,
Yeah,
and you
I
can
have
call
his
him.
number. I've
Okay,
been
okay.
meaning to.
Right. It's an irony that he happens to call me. You know, we don't speak that often. We do speak occasionally, but it's an irony that I'm taking. So, how do you want me to pick that up again?
Oh, we were talking about when you read the JAMA articles.
Right. Okay.
You were shocked at
Right,
your
okay.
organization.
Well, you know, as a physician, when I read the Journal of American Medical Association articles, I was already then familiar enough with the subject to know that a lot of what they had published in JAMA was simply untrue. And, you know, I was quite surprised that it had passed the peer review process to make it into the print in a peer review journal. And so I wrote a letter to the Journal of the American Medical Association, and the editors had, I'm sure, lots to pick from. They picked mine. And then I saw something happen that I'd never seen happen before, and that is that the letter was written to the autopsy doctors who'd done Jack Kennedy's autopsy and who were quoted in the journal saying a lot of stuff that was sort of nonsensical. So I asked them very direct questions, and many of the other letters to the editor also asked them very direct questions, and I'd never seen it happen before in science. But they stonewalled every question that the editors of the journal itself had picked. And I thought to myself, something is very wrong here if in a peer review scientific journal, letters to the editor by fellow physicians who are not cranky conspiracy crackpots, but practicing physicians are stonewalled. So I then began petitioning the American Medical Association directly through my own representative, who happened to work alongside me in San Francisco every day as my anesthesiologist, and he had no luck. We were particularly taken by one thing, and that is that there was a doctor who'd written a book named Charles Crenshaw, who'd written a book. He was a Parkland doctor who had taken care of Jack Kennedy after the assassination at Parkland Hospital, and who said Jack Kennedy's wounds were not consistent with him having been shot by Oswald. And he wrote a book called Conspiracy of Silence. And he was savage in the Journal of the American Medical Association that said that, well, we have no reason to believe he's true because the doctors who were there, who they interviewed in the journal, don't ever even recall him being there. He probably wasn't there. Well, as we then, as members of the Medical Association, wrote the journal, we said, look, here is the evidence for it. I think that you need to correct the record. This is a libelous statement against a fellow American Medical Association member, and it's simply not true. They never corrected the record, and they ignored our letter. We didn't even get a response back to it. It finally cost the American Medical Association at least $250,000 plus their own expenses, because Charles Crenshaw, who was ill then and has since died, sued them, and they settled right out of court for $250,000. Well, very embarrassing to me. I immediately dropped my membership in the American Medical Association, and I tell doctors that I work with now, young doctors I work with, that, you know, unfortunately, it's not an organization that has earned the respect nor the dues of its own membership, unfortunately. In any case, that got my interest going. If you could get something like that in a journal and that they would stonewall professionals, what is going on? And, you know, one can be very paranoid about things, but I think there's a much simpler explanation. And I think it may explain why the press has stayed on board, despite the fact the vast majority of not only the learned public, but the mass majority of public are critics. I mean, there are 6 books now in the in university published books on the subject of the Kennedy assassination. These are books that undergo special scrutiny because they're published by University of California Press, Harvard University Press, and so on and so forth. Every book by a university publishing house is pro-conspiracy. There isn't a journalist worth his salt, except a few, perhaps, but virtually none in the mainstream media that will even acknowledge that and knows that. Well, how do these people all get brought on board? How did the Journal of the American Medical Association get brought on board? Well, in the case of the American Medical Association, I think that what happened was that its editor, George Lomberg, happened himself to have been a former military pathologist and happened to be a friend of one of the autopsy surgeons. He saw the film JFK, was outraged at the way physicians were, the autopsy surgeons were characterized as having worked under intense pressure to come to pre-dawn conclusions. And he reached out to his old friend, Dr. Humes, Commander Humes, who had been one of the autopsy surgeons, the chief autopsy surgeon, and wrote him a letter, which I have seen a copy of, saying, this movie is 3 hours of lies. Will you come forward and tell your story and tell the truth to the public? And so they came out with these articles heralded as the first time these doctors had ever talked, which of course we knew wasn't true to begin with, because they talked several times before, including under oath on 2 occasions, before the Warren Commission, before the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and during other interviews that had been published. But in other cases, it was big fanfare. The American Medical Association arranged for a press conference in New York, and George Lomberg's motivation for this was that he was a man of undoubted patriotism, saw his colleague, Dr. Humes, who he knew personally to be a man of integrity and honesty, being essentially savaged by his depiction in this film as somebody who was working under tremendous pressure to come up to conclusions that may not have been truthful conclusions. And so he thought, well, I've got to do something, I've got to do the right thing, not only for my profession, not only for physicians, not only for military physicians, but for the whole country. And I think that he did that out of a sense of patriotism. And then you find in life, I've found in life, that when people commit themselves forcefully to a position, it's very difficult for them to back off of that position and change their mind. I debated George Lomberg along with a lot of other people, including Dr. Cyril Wecht and other people, and we brought this to his attention, and we kept saying, look, Dr. Charles Crenshaw, who you say wasn't there, was in fact there. Will you correct the record? We told them that publicly, in addition to the letters that we'd written to the American Medical Association as members of the American Medical Association. They never did until they were forced to do so by court, just for that reason. So the press is in much the same situation. They're not going to familiarize themselves with this enormously complicated subject to realize the whole of the official story. And so they basically go along with the people who they trust. And who do you trust? Do you trust some critic or the Chief Justice of the United States? Do you trust some sleazebag lawyer or, in one era, the head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, J. Edgar Hoover? Well, of course, it's a different era now. Now we know you don't trust, and you should not have never trusted J. Edgar Hoover. He was an absolute criminal and a beast. But J. Edgar Hoover ensured that the truth would be that Oswald did it, and he did it alone. And we found this out from the Church Committee, that he guaranteed that truth would be the truth that the Warren Commission arrived at, because, as the Church Committee put it, he file-checked all of the Warren Commissioners and their staff for derogatory information, quote unquote. Now, J. Edgar Hoover didn't keep these files and didn't check people for derogatory information because he wanted to make certain they weren't communist. Did he need to look for derogatory information to ensure that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court wasn't a communist, or that Senator Russell wasn't a communist, or that any of the other members, Gerald Ford, and so on and so forth? No, he file-checked them for derogatory information because he had arrived at conclusions, and in fact announced conclusions in a phone call to J. Edgar Hoover, to LBJ, that Oswald had done it and done it alone within an hour and a half or 2 hours of Oswald's arrest. He was already convinced that Oswald had done it alone. Well, it would have been very embarrassing for the FBI if a conspiracy had taken the life of a president and they had missed it. He had a vested interest in there having been no conspiracy, and he was damn well sure that it was going to end up being that there was no conspiracy. And the mainstream media, as we've seen repeatedly, falls in line. I mean, as they fell in line on the Iraq War, and you could find articles by Warren Strobel and the McClatchy news outlets questioning the intelligence, saying that there were imminent weapons of mass destruction that threatened us. You could see it all over the international press, but boy, the New York Times, Washington Post, same thing happened in the Kennedy era. A decision is made. It seems reasonable, perhaps, to most people. Some people know it isn't reasonable, but the decision is made. It comes down. People know that their careers are at stake if they challenge the official wisdom, and they don't, and they haven't. The mainstream press hasn't. And if you were to ask anyone in the mainstream press, what's the considered opinion among, say, knowledgeable intellectuals on the subject of the Kennedy assassination, they say, oh, there was no conspiracy. Well, not according to all the papers that have been published by university publishing houses. They're all pro-conspiracy, but no one in the mainstream media knows that. So the medical evidence is an interesting, an absolutely fascinating subject in the Kennedy case, because one of the things that became very apparent to me is that I think that the autopsy pathologists were honorable men who were caught in an enormous maelstrom that swirled around them quite unexpectedly, and they found themselves in a position where they were chosen without proper credentials or background to do the autopsy of the century. These are men who were hospital pathologists who did autopsies of natural death, deaths from heart attacks, strokes, and so on and so forth, not unnatural death. They weren't forensic pathologists. They didn't deal with gunshots, stabbings, poisonings, and that sort of thing. So, in the grand scheme of things, they were quite competent. In fact, they taught young doctors how to do pathology autopsies as pathology residents at Bethesda Naval Hospital, a very credible institution. But they had no background in forensic pathology. They were chosen because they decided they were going to do the autopsy at the Naval Hospital. They could have had any pathologist in the country come in as a consultant. There was no one who would have refused his duty to do such an important autopsy, and yet they closed up shop, closed up ranks, and these two pathologists, Humes and Boswell, got going on Jack Kennedy's autopsy. As they got into it a little bit, they said, geez, we probably ought to have a forensic specialist around here. And they said, can we call over to the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology and see if we can get somebody over there? And they found Pierre Fink, who joined them about a half an hour after they'd been going. Now, it turns out that Pierre Fink was a certified autopsy pathologist, but he wasn't a hands-on autopsy pathologist. He was someone who reviewed the autopsies of others. Autopsies require continuous hands-on work. It'd be like bringing someone who had been a tennis star that had not lifted a racket for a couple of years into an important tennis match. You would not get the performance you'd expect. And similarly, Fink, who was in the Army, was brought in to what was famously referred to as an Old Navy reunion at Bethesda, where he's in a room where he is outranked right, left, and center. There's all sorts of brass there. Secretary of the Navy's there. A lot of other people outranking him are there. And he thinks his role is there is just to offer them advice. Meanwhile, a couple of guys who really have no ability to do what they're doing have already destroyed a lot of the evidence in the autopsy. They took the brain out before the only forensic pathologist around, Pierre Fink, even got there, and they were doing a lot of other things, obviously distorting clues. Well, when you read the autopsy report, what you'll read in the autopsy report is something which is very interesting. If you look at the handwritten autopsy report, it says that 3 shots were heard and the president fell forward to the floor of the limousine. Well, where did they come up with that idea? 3 shots were heard and the president fell forward? Well, it turns out that the autopsy report says that there was a journalist, a fellow named Robert Jackson, whose report apparently was in the press the day afterward, which they read, saying 3 shots were heard, the president fell forward. And it was on the basis of that hearsay evidence that they had no doubt also heard during the time of the autopsy that guided the findings. So they basically were men who did not know how to do what they were charged with doing, who were given what they thought was credible information and given a body. Okay, you got a body. There were 3 shots. The president fell forward with those shots. He's obviously hit from behind. Here's a body, figure out how it happened. And so naturally they came up with conclusions showing that, well, the autopsy proves they were shot from behind. But the way they oriented the wounds, the way they described the wounds and the location of the wounds were in huge violation of the way autopsy pathologists normally describe description of wounds. There were huge errors made. And afterward, I think that there's no doubt but that there was a cover-up, and that they were unfortunately very reluctant but witting parties to that cover-up. What are we talking about? Well, in the autopsy report and in his testimony afterward, Dr. Humes talked about there having been photographs taken of the interior of the chest and of the skull wound. Well, those autopsy photographs don't exist. In 1967 and 1968, for the first time, the autopsy pathologist, knowing that the autopsy was going to be examined again, or at least the government was raising questions about it, the autopsy pathologists were brought in to look now for the first time at the autopsy pathology photographs that they'd never seen. They'd done the autopsy, photographs were taken, they'd never seen the photographs while they were writing up their autopsy report originally. They'd looked at the x-rays on that night, but they'd never seen the photographs. So now they're brought in 1967 and 68 to look at the autopsy photographs, and they look at them, and they sign an affidavit that is prepared by the Justice Department saying that all the autopsy photographs that we have looked at are all the autopsy photographs that were taken, and there were none other taken. Well, they'd already, Humes particularly, had already testified that autopsy photographs had been taken, and they clearly weren't in the file of autopsy photographs. A few years later, before the House Select Committee on Assassinations, Humes and Boswell, and also Dr. Fink, talked emphatically about having taken photographs that didn't ever show up in the file of official autopsy photographs, which I've seen by special permission of the Kennedy family. So here are men who have signed an affidavit knowing that it was false, that all the autopsy photographs have been are present and accounted for, knowing that they weren't. This is the sort of thing that that leads you to believe that there was tremendous pressure being brought on these people to come to certain conclusions that would be consistent with the position that Oswald had acted alone. There was tremendous pressure, I think, brought to bear to get these men to do these things. And people I've spoken to who knew them personally say that whenever the question would come up, they would speak quite anxiously and nervously about the situation, and I think that they were basically forced into taking certain positions which they would never have done and probably never did after that in their own professional lives. I think they lived quite honorable lives and were just caught up in one of the great tragedies of American history. Um, where we go from here, it's not clear, except that we know that you can't trust the autopsy record to be a completely reliable record because evidence is missing. The brain is missing from the autopsy. There are tissue slides taken that are missing from the autopsy that might be very telling. Slides taken showing where, taken from the edges of wounds that were taken from the time of the autopsy that might tell us whether wounds were entrance wounds or not entrance wounds. Those things are missing.
I guess you hit on something really interesting. Let's see, ask this: why the public trust the media, the Fourth Estate, government investigations, etc.? Why has the study of the case been left to individuals?
There have been a few people involved in the government and in the media who have had a sincere interest in this case and pursued this. But your question is a very important one, and that is that important things that should never have been missed were missed originally. For example, Jim Garrison was the first person to have made note of something that should have been noted right from the get-go, and that is that the address stamped on Lee Harvey Oswald's Fair Play for Cuba committee pamphlets that he was passing around New Orleans, supposedly in favor of the Cuban government, and many of us suspect that he was actually an agent provocateur, but he was passing those around and had the address 544 Camp Street. Well, it turns out that 544 Camp Street was a side entrance to an office that was owned and operated by a well-known former FBI agent named Guy Bannister, who was involved in anti-Castro operations. The FBI did 25,000 interviews or some ridiculous things and didn't find that fact out. I mean, it was a pretty big fact. I think that what happened in the Kennedy case is symptomatic of what we've seen happen many times since then. As I now understand it, much to my dismay, even though I was a big proponent of the Vietnam War in its era, I now clearly understand that we were deceived about the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The press never raised any questions about that at the time. Maybe some radicals on the left did, but no one else did. The New York Times, Washington Post, and the rest of the mainstream media, week after week, day after day, month after month, published obviously exaggerated reports about the war and the progress and the successes and the lights at the end of the tunnel. People on the ground were shaking their heads in disbelief that these reports were going forward. The mainstream media did not stand up against power at that time until finally the New York Times did, and as I understand it, somewhat reluctantly when it published the Pentagon Papers. Uh, we saw during the 1980s the United States was involved, much to its shame, and I've done charity work in Latin America where I've seen and spoken to people who were on the ground at the time and were grew up as Republican right wingers and were priests and nuns working in Latin America, shocked to see what side America was on in what were nasty, dirty wars, where we were supporting absolute tyrants against democracies in places like Guatemala and Chile and Argentina and Brazil. And the press originally raised a few questions about that. Ray Bonner wrote a brilliant piece in the New York Times about a terrible massacre in El Salvador at El Mozote, I think in January 25th, 1982, only to then have the full force and weight of the government come down on him. And the New York Times showed it had absolutely no courage. It yanked Ray Bonner, who'd been the Latin American correspondent, out of El Salvador and basically gave him a desk job reporting on dog bites in the back alleys of New York City, a huge demotion, and he resigned. And that story about the El Mozote massacre, which had been conducted by an elite battalion that had been trained by the United States, the Atlantl Battalion, that story died and would have stayed dead had it not been for a UN brokered peace initiative in which they reinvestigated that massacre and found out literally 10 years later that virtually everything that Ray Bonner had reported originally had been true. But what tends to happen is reasonable journalists under tremendous pressure and being told by extremely respectable people. For an example of Ray Bonner, no less than Tom Enders, who was a very high State Department official, came out to say, look, we're very concerned about this report of Ray Bonner's about the El Mozote massacre. We've sent our investigators up there to investigate this, and we are unable to confirm any truth to the report of a massacre being up there. And then, of course, then you had Jeane Kirkpatrick, who was our ambassador to the UN from her pulpit there, bellowing about how the Ray Bonner, the New York Times and Washington Post had also published the story under Alma Guillermo Prieto, had been duped by the communists. And then that became the drumbeat, duped by the communists, duped by the communists, duped by the communists, and everyone ran away from the story. Well, in a similar way with the Kennedy case, I think that, and we've seen this again, by the way, with the Iraq War and the imminence of weapons of mass destruction. The only people to have raised questions about that were a few peripheral news outlets, the McClatchy news outlets, and so on and so forth, in the international press. The mainstream media was rolled by that one, and subsequent to that has been very reluctant to admit how they were rolled by it. I think people's careers depend on it. Ray Bonner's career was destroyed for that. Robert Perry's brilliant career for breaking Iran-Contra stories was destroyed for his having done that, despite never having been caught in a lie. And there are example after example. I think that people learn that there are some stories that are very important and that it may be inimical to your hopes for the future, the security of your kids' tuitions and your mortgage payments if you think too hard or look too hard at certain subjects that become unfashionable, for lack of a better word. And I think in the Kennedy case, great effort has been made to make the subject, the idea of a conspiracy, unfashionable. You see that recently in Vincent Bugliosi's book. Vincent Bugliosi's book was heralded in the mainstream media. We always, we know what they're going to do. So you get people, writing glowingly in the New York Times and the Washington Post and Los Angeles Times about it. What a magnificent achievement it is, and 2,600 pages, and gosh, this is the final definitive answer. Well, the book is a book of advocacy written by a lawyer who's the consummate advocate, and the reviewers are routinely completely ignorant of the subject. It's a very complicated subject. When the New York Times assigns a reviewer to review a book on economics, it picks somebody who's a professor of economics someplace, somebody who has credentials in economics. When they find a reviewer for a book on history or on literature or anything else, they find someone who has an expertise. Well, you know that the people that are picked by the Washington Post, LA Times, the New York Times to review books on the Kennedy case know nothing about the case, because all you have to do is look in the index of Boyosi's own book, where he lists virtually everyone who's ever written on the subject, and you'll find that none of these reviewers are listed. They don't know anything about the subject. They've never written anything about it. Well, the reviewer for the Los Angeles Times, a fellow named Jim Newton, did write a pro-Warren Commission piece one time in a book he wrote about Earl Warren. He has 8 or 10 pages about the wonders of the Warren Commission. So you know you have a Warren advocate, Warren Commission advocate writing that review. But apart from that, he really knows nothing about the case, and he's going to weigh in on a subject that I submit considerably more complicated than economics is, for example. But that's how it's done, because the conclusions, it is fashionable to side with the government on that the government would not lie to the public about the death of their president. It's just inconceivable. Well, when I was a young man, I would have thought it was inconceivable the government would have lied to us about what it lied to us about the Gulf of Tonkin, about its involvement in dirty wars in Latin America, about its picking people up off the streets of America and dosing them with LSD and the MK Ultra program. These are all things that you can find out about. And they're all available on the internet now. You can read declassified government documents and read about how the government's done these things. I mean, there's a lot we've learned about the government that now has us understand things differently. And all along the way, journalists don't want to spend the time really digging in and doing the research because they have so many other jobs at hand, and particularly in the Kennedy case, it's an enormously conflicted affair. There are Warren critics writing who are, very irresponsible. I'll be the first to admit it. And so you read books that are written by people who are kind of on the crazy side, and you think, God, these guys are all crazy. Well, read some books written by people who are quite knowledgeable, and they're very compelling. And just read what's out there in the peer-reviewed literature. Recently, a historian who got his PhD from Harvard, who teaches at the Naval War College, so he's not an anti-American, I shouldn't think. I don't think they have, too many communists teaching at the Naval War College. David Kaiser's his name. Very thoughtful fellow. He's written a book called The Road to Dallas, published by the Harvard University Press, and again takes a pro-conspiracy position. I don't agree with some of his conclusions because he has the mafia having done it. And I think that one has to stretch things quite a bit to think that the mafia would have been able to pull off the assassination of a president without anyone else having noticed or having gone after them. I think that there had to have been protection of the operation at very high levels of government. And we know right away that J. Edgar Hoover file-checked the Warren commissioners to ensure that there would be loyalty to his conclusions, which he'd reached on the afternoon of the assassination, and FBI agents who would bring in information that challenged the official version, knew that they'd be in big trouble for doing so, and the press has been, very uncourageous on this matter. It's not uncommon. I mean, even my own journal, the Journal of the American Medical Association. Well, I'm no longer a member of the American Medical Association, but JAMA, I mean, it really shamed itself. It was embarrassing to me. And even when they finally wrote, this is a hilarious example. Here I was working cheek by jowl, week after week, with my AMA representative in an operating room because he was my anesthesiologist, a terrific guy. Probably shouldn't name him, but a wonderful guy. And so finally, the Journal of the American Medical Association, after losing $250,000 plus whatever enormous amount of money it cost them to prosecute their own defense against the charge, wrote a correction. They then slammed Dr. Crenshaw again, who they'd criticized to begin with, that led to their losing $250,000. They slammed him again and reproduced a quote from the Warren Commission. Well, I said, I came into the operating room that day and I said, well, look, I just want you to know how sleazy your outfit is, my former outfit is, American Medical Association. I said, here they're quoting the Warren Commission. Okay, I went down to the library and copied off the page from the Warren Commission volume itself. Here's the page, here's their quote. look how deviously they've misrepresented the American Medical Association, I mean, the Warren Commission's own testimony. I mean, it's shameless. It's almost criminal. I said, it's the reason why I tell my residents not to join the American Medical Association and not to pay any attention to what these guys write when they're writing on matters that are as politically charged as this. I think their scientific journalism is fine. I think when they get into politics, um, they're going to roll over for the government if in fact that's what they feel they have to do. Um, but there are a lot of reasons why journalism has failed us repeatedly, from Vietnam to the wars in Latin America, the Iran-Contra scandal. One guy was a hero, and they destroyed him for it. Robert Perry, the journalist who broke the scandals and won the Polk Award for investigative journalism for having done so. He's a hero, and still writes today. Has a news outlet on the web called consortiumnews.com, which is excellent.
Let me ask you something. They say 80% of the United States, of the American public, believe that there was a conspiracy, or they disbelieve the Warren Commission report.
Right.
Yet, John Judge said people believe it, but they're not allowed to know anything. So I guess my question is, if 80% of people still disbelieve the Warren Commission, why is it still propagated in the major media? How is that happening?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. How has it happened that the mainstream media continues to propagate something which is not only not accepted by the vast majority of their reading public, but even by what you might call the knowledgeable authorities, people publishing university published books? I mean, let's ignore the hundreds of books that are pro-conspiracy that are out there in mainstream publishers, from Knopf to other publishing houses. Let's just university publishing houses alone are all pro-conspiracy. Well, how can the mainstream media do that? Well, as a physician, I have some insight into how, when when an idea gets fixed in a person's life somewhat strongly, it becomes almost impossible to dislodge it. I've seen it happen over and over and over again with older physicians that believed certain ways of managing certain diseases. And as new evidence comes along, most will come around and change things. But some people, it's very difficult for them to change the patterns of a career, patterns of a lifetime in practice. Similarly, certain people are convinced of certain themes historically, that there was foreknowledge of Pearl Harbor, or that there was not foreknowledge of Pearl Harbor. New evidence comes along, and people will always try to fit it into the framework that they have always had about this. And I think that in the Kennedy case, it was automatic right from the get-go, a fairly complicated affair. Lots of confusing details about who was Oswald. Was he really, a commie? Could he really have defected to Russia the way he did and promised to turn over state secrets and then return to the United States and not been arrested at the height of the Cold War? Could he have been maybe one of the guys working on our sites? All this was even swirling in the air right away afterward, and it was very confusing to people. And finally, people whose opinions we all thought we could trust, J. Edgar Hoover, Earl Warren, Richard Russell, Senator Richard Russell, John McCloy, and a few other people came forward and said, look, we've taken a good, hard look at this. This is the truth. Oswald did it alone. And then, people went, whew, okay. And they invested very heavily in that. I mean, but even then, and once they've invested their own names and reputations in a position, they will find 100 reasons never to reverse themselves. And not that there wasn't a certain amount of chicanery going on from the get-go. If you read the New York Times edition of the Warren Report, published right simultaneously with a government-issued volume, there's an introductory essay by a man who's still writing, Anthony Lewis, a credible journalist by all accounts, writing for the New York Times, then now writes occasional pieces for the New York Review of Books and other places, and the New York Times. really a credible journalist, and he wrote in there at the outset of the publication of the Warren Report that the Warren Commission had released all the information that it had gathered during its investigation, whether it agreed with its conclusions or not. Well, that's absolutely untrue. I mean, absolutely untrue. Now, I've written Anthony Lewis, physician to Anthony Lewis, asking him, did you come up with this idea yourself, or did someone on the Warren Commission tell you that they had released all their evidence? Because we now know, after all the evidence has come out, that when the Warren Commission was first published, they were hiding literally hundreds of thousands of pages from the public. Could not see, never knew even existed. Now, did they lie to Anthony Lewis about that, and he passed along the lie, or was it Anthony Lewis's lie? Anthony Lewis won't answer my letter. I've written him 3 times. Journalists, he committed himself to a position on the case. And now that people are drawing attention to perhaps his having behaved a little bit below the standard that we expect of someone of that caliber and that reputation, doesn't want to talk about it. Wants to leave the subject, wants to pretend it doesn't exist. It's embarrassing. It's humiliating. And I think it would be embarrassing for the mainstream media today for them to acknowledge that they were asleep at the switch. That it took guys out digging there to find stuff that they should have found themselves, and they could have had a much easier time finding given their skills as investigators. But it's taken individuals to do this sort of stuff, to piece this sort of stuff together, to point out the fact that we've caught the autopsy pathologist lying, the fact that we've caught the government lying to us repeatedly about what it's told us and what it hasn't told us, that we've caught the government misrepresenting what is reported to the public. One of the most shameful episodes that bears repeating here is that there was an apparent discrepancy between what the descriptions of how Kennedy looked when he came in with his injuries at Dallas Hospital and the injuries he had when he arrived for the autopsy in Washington at Bethesda. And people kept saying, well, look, the doctors in Dallas said that he had, a big hole in the back of his head. And yet, the autopsy photographs don't seem to show those. Well, of course, a couple of autopsy photographs that might have shown those that the doctors testified they took are missing from the file. Nevertheless, there was some questions being raised. I mean, we had a professor of neurosurgery saying he had a hole in the back of his head, as well as a lot of other doctors saying he had a hole in the back of his head. And so the House Select Committee on Assassinations, ultimately found in favor of conspiracy, reported on this very issue. And the House Select Committee on Assassination said, well, we've gone and interviewed the witnesses at the autopsy, and it turns out that the doctors in Dallas were wrong. All the witnesses at the autopsy said that there was no hole in the back of his head, and that his wounds looked just like they look in the autopsy photographs. And everybody said, oh, well, that's news. But then, just like the Warren Commission had, the House Select Committee on Assassination suppressed all those interviews. These guys said that he looked just like the autopsy photographs. Where are the interviews? We'd like to see them. Well, they didn't come out until the Assassination Records Review Board released them in the early mid-1990s. And all of a sudden they come out, and guess what? The witnesses at the autopsy described the wounds exactly as the witnesses at Dallas had, that he had a hole in the back of his head. So the House Select Committee on Assassination had falsified his own interviews to be consistent with the autopsy conclusions that they wanted to reach, that Oswald could have done it. Yeah, he may have had help. That's what they finally concluded. There was a conspiracy, but Oswald done all the shooting. And in order to fit this enormously complicated, fact pattern into something that you could recognize, they fudged the truth a little bit. They lied. And, I caught him at the lie. I'm the one that caught him at the lie. They were very unhappy about that when they found out that, we had declassified and proved that you couldn't even trust the pro-conspiracy House Select Committee on Assassinations to tell you the full truth. They were still hiding things that were sort of inimical to the government's position, still defending the government's lies, still defending the government's misrepresentation of the truth. So the fact that the mainstream media, is willing to defend the government's mistruths shouldn't be a surprise. They're not going to devote the kind of time that it takes to really get to the truth. Because if they were to do so, they would waste an enormous amount of time that they need to use doing other things, supporting a family and a career and so on and so forth. And then they might destroy the career and the family that they've worked so hard for by doing so. So you find it over and over and over again, whether it's, Warren Commission, the Ron Contra affair, the Watergate scandal, other things. The press often doesn't show a lot of courage, although in the Watergate there was some courage there, although it's not even clear that we even know all of what went on there. There's probably still some untruths. Um, but it's unfortunately a common human foible for people to decide something, decide that's true, and then defend that to the death, regardless of the evidence that comes out. I mean, here we were facing the very respected Journal of the American Medical Association editor, George Lundberg, in a debate, challenging him to tell the public the truth. He wouldn't do it. What kind of integrity and honesty is there to that? Very embarrassing to me. I immediately said, well, that's the last American Medical Association membership payment I ever make. I mean, I thought it was a respectable organization. I thought it was an honest organization. I thought it was an organization that if you wrote them a letter, they'd write you back. They wouldn't even do that. It was amazing. And it cost, and we warned them. We said, correct the factual record on the Kennedy case. It might cost you money. This is a libelous statements you're making there. They wouldn't even do it for that reason. So at least they paid that $250,000 settlement with dues that weren't mine. They were other AMA members because I was no longer a member by the time they paid it. But and you see, why would an editor of a journal do something like that? Well, he would do it because he has faith in his associate, a man of great reputation and an honorable, honest man, the head autopsy doctor, Dr. Humes. He knows him personally. He knows him not to be. He's going to stand with him. Well, I mean, Dr. Humes got himself caught in a whirlwind of history in which he was in no position to change the decisions that were coming down from a position way above him, and would have been destroyed had he ever tried to do so. And in every other respect in his life, no doubt, he lived an honorable life. But for this, he had to compromise his integrity. He had to sacrifice and tell things that are really true. You either have to believe that he was really stupid lying, Dr. Humes and Boswell and Fink, or that they knowingly lied. And I'm not willing to conclude that they're dumb. And I think that they did what they had to do because they knew that there would be no end to the horror if they actually told the truth that they knew. And which is the reason why they, subsequent to that, had been they wouldn't answer letters to the editor published by the Journal of the American Medical Association, nor would Fink answer letters published by the Journal of the American Medical Association. They only spoke to a fellow former military pathologist. When the Assassination Records Review Board asked the autopsy pathologist to come forward and testify to the review board, they initially declined to do so. They wouldn't do so. Well, the review board had a lot of experience handling, reluctant witnesses like that, and they basically threatened to subpoena, and they basically said, well, essentially they said, we're going to arrest you if you don't come down here and testify. You come willingly, or you come under force of subpoena. And so then they finally reluctantly showed up. And so the questions that I had not gotten answers to when I'd written them in the Journal of the American Medical Association, they were then ultimately forced to testify to under oath because I, helped furnish some of those questions. We see this happening over and over and over again. We're seeing it in Iraq today in the war, a consistent pattern of the media, standing with the government, and I think that some things don't change, and they certainly haven't changed since the Kennedy case.
Perfect. I'm going to change directions a little bit right now. A lot in the media, kind of devil's advocate, they always say, well, people believe it. 80% of the people in America believe it because they just can't accept the fact that a lone nut could change America like that, could kill our beloved president.
Yeah, what you're hinting at is something which has been bandied about a lot in the press, and that is that you look at the situation of this, poorly educated, poor, ineffectual stumblebum of a guy, Lee Harvey Oswald, on one side of the ledger, and you look at the President of the United States on the other side of the ledger, and it just seems too improbable that someone who is as incompetent as this poor, guy is, could have actually altered the course of history. It just doesn't make sense. And so there must have been a conspiracy because there's such an imbalance. Well, you know, that would be one way of looking at it, and certainly, I'm sympathetic to the idea that people would be seeing things that way, except for the fact that um, if you pull up to a gas station just after it's been robbed, and you see a couple of guys jump into their car and drive away at 100 miles an hour, and you happen to be in your, highway patrol cruiser, and you track them down. Um, as you walk up to their car, you have very good reason to suspect that their suspicious behavior suggests that there was something, that they were involved in something illegal. In the Kennedy case, with respect to the government, we have thousands of examples of the government trampling on evidence, leaning on witnesses, destroying evidence, uh, trying to shape evidence over and over and over and over again. Okay, a lone nut, open and shut case. Why do they keep doing that? Why do they keep, doing that? I mean, we have examples of FBI agents telling people that, if you didn't see Oswald do it, you didn't see it. You have, you know, FBI agents testifying that, they would turn in things, were told to rewrite it. You have witnesses being told that they were told to testify to certain things, and if they didn't testify to that, they were told to change it. You have people who'd read their testimony as transcribed, and they said, I didn't say that. And you have example after example after example of this. One has to wonder, okay, if it's so simple, open and shut, why for so many years has the government lied about the evidence? Why has it misrepresented the evidence? Why has it withheld the evidence? Why is there a lot of evidence that you can't even read now until the year 2029? There's still files that are going to be suppressed until 2029. There was a CIA agent named Joe Anides, who was involved in the Miami station that was involved in the anti-Cuban operations. He then became the liaison between the House Select Committee of Assassinations and the CIA. This is a man who knew everything about what was going on then and the actors that were involved. This is a man who should have been under oath, and this is a man who knew of Oswald's, knew a lot more about Oswald than he ever let on, who basically kept the public in the dark about this. Now, the former chief counsel for the House Select Committee on Assassinations, named Robert Blakey, used to defend the CIA, saying, well, I've known these guys for years and years and years. They're honorable men. They wouldn't lie to me. When he found out that the Joe Anides character had basically stonewalled him and lied to him, he basically said that, that the CIA had corrupted his investigation. They had, suppressed the truth from the public. Well, the public does have, there are publicly held things that are somewhat irresponsible, but we have had so many years of continually a leak after leak after leak in the Kennedy case of where the government has been caught with its pants down over and over and over again. If it was defending the truth, sure, they might have been made a few mistakes out of zeal to make certain things were done a certain way, but the kinds of lies, the kinds of misrepresentations have shown the government in a very bad light, and I think reflects well on the public's skepticism about the government's conclusions. The government wouldn't behave that way if it was innocent. Just wouldn't do it. Just as guys who were not involved in cracking a gas station wouldn't have gotten in their car and driven away at 100 miles an hour, probably. Um, it's just common sense. It's a street level thing. You don't have to have a PhD in physics or an MD, to understand it. You just have to see the government in action, continuously being caught in its. I mean, how many times it didn't take us too long to begin mistrusting the government's reports about about Vietnam War after the Pentagon Papers came out. But we got thousands of papers and thousands of pages out that show the government in a consistent pattern of deceiving the public. Well, we've got thousands of pages out now, and it's taken, we've had to pull teeth to get a lot of these pages out. And again, it showed the government lying over and over and over again. Has the government earned the right to expect the people to believe its conclusion about the Warren Commission when it's been caught so often in lies? No, I don't think so.
Do you